Arcade at home? Not if Capcom has its way. It's Metroidvania Works, episode 19. This episode brings us two NES games by Capcom that ostensibly seem like they should tie in with the company's arcade releases by the same name. But as Strider and Willow demonstrate, that's boomer thinking. With both Strider and Willow, Capcom opted not to convert its arcade games to the console, but rather to just build entirely new games from scratch. That choice seems fairly obvious in Willow, which went from being a Black Tiger-style action platformer with light RPG components to a proper top-down Zelda-style action RPG. However, Strider's move away from the coin-op is less intuitive, since the game initially seems like just a really bad take on the incredible arcade original. I'll dig more into that once we get to NES Works, but for the purposes of this video, I'm more concerned with the whats than the wherefores. Like the arcade game, Strider begins on a platform in Kazakh, somehow still a socialist republic despite the adventure's far future setting. Protagonist Hiryu runs forward and slashes robots and Cossack guards with his plasma sword Cypher, and that's about all this game has in common with the other. The Strider coin-op presented itself almost as an action film, thrusting players into a non-stop series of high-tempo set pieces. On NES, Strider takes a more leisurely approach, sending Hiryu around the world to some of the same settings as seen in the arcade, but in a less linear fashion. The overall structure falls somewhere between that of a proper Metroidvania and an action RPG. In this sense, it shares a lot in common with BIONIC Commando for NES. Each area of the world is self-contained and you unlock access to different regions by gathering items and story clues. Where Strider differs from BIONIC Commando, and in fact nearly every other game we've seen here outside of Metroid and Blaster Master, is that you need to revisit many areas of the game in order to explore new corners of those locations. Like Metroid's Brinstar and Blaster Master's Area 1, Kazakh becomes almost a sort of hub locale, divided up by barriers and partitions that you can only clear once you've ventured into different places to collect clues and equipment capable of opening those locks. Some of these barriers are more elegant than others. The most straightforward and uninteresting of the gates are literally that, gates, which bear a numeric code and can only be opened once Hiryu finds the corresponding key. These aptly appear in your inventory as a comically literal, key-shaped item of the future. All told, Hiryu needs to gather about half a dozen of these keys in order to gain entry into locations that you see straight away once you begin the adventure, most vexingly a level 3 gate that shows up right inside the Kazakh base but can't be accessed for ages. Hiryu tends to reveal multiple locations at a time as he explores the early portions of the game, which gives his quest a non-linear feel. In reality, the game has a less open-ended design than appearances would suggest. For example, as you make your first foray into the Kazakh base, you'll find a pair of data disks that contain files leading you to two new destinations, Australia and Egypt. Once you analyze the disks in your orbital, dragon-shaped satellite home base, Hiryu gains the ability to teleport down into both locales. But going to Australia does you no good because you immediately reach a dead end at a level 5 door that doesn't serve any purpose until the end of the game. On top of that, several locations turn out to be almost entirely immaterial. Japan, for example, more or less consists of 3 rooms that you can clear in about 5 minutes. The reality is that Strider just doesn't have much substance. Its half dozen or so locations are either incredibly tiny or else designed in such a way that you really only have a single pathway through the setting each time you visit. The level design does attempt to obfuscate the modest size and straightforward level layouts by dropping you into large, sometimes confusing spaces that appear to offer multiple corridors to explore, but in almost every instance you'll find that venturing outside of the critical path either leads to an immediate dead end, or else simply doubles back around and drops you back to where you were a moment before, accomplishing nothing besides wasting your time. It doesn't help that Strider is shockingly glitchy and hard to play, considering it comes from the same Capcom who temporarily gave us BIONIC Commando and Mega Man 2. You won't find any of the buttery smooth animation and silken controls of those games here, though. Unlike his arcade counterpart, a futuristic ninja who set a new standard for the medium's expectations of character animation and control capabilities, this Hiryu moves clumsily. His cipher has no reach to speak of and can't be extended or powered up the way it can in arcades, despite the presence of a permanent inventory and level up system that would seem an obvious hook for sword enhancements. Hiryu also lacks the ability to pinwheel acrobatically through the air, to climb walls, and to stick to ceilings. He can't really do much besides run and jump, with a few alternate abilities like a sliding kick and running on water coming into play once you acquire the requisite boots for those powers. Hiryu does possess one unique innate skill, the triangle jump. Meant as a replacement for his arcade counterpart's ability to use his short blade as a climbing python, the triangle jump ostensibly allows players to reach different areas by leaping at a wall and using it as a springboard. In theory, you can chain this ability infinitely, allowing you to climb shafts by bouncing from one wall to the other, rising a little higher with each leap. In practice, good luck. The triangle jump requires more or less frame-perfect timing, demanding you tap the jump button and press the opposite direction from the wall you want to spring away from at the precise moment you make contact. Although you can use the skill repeatedly, and have to in order to complete the game, it always feels like a matter of idiot luck when you actually manage to pull it off. The triangle jump hardly represents Strider's only control shortcomings. Hiryu has a difficult time with jumps in general, and frequently hits invisible barriers right above the ground when attempting to leap. Slopes prove particularly challenging, as jumping from an angled surface almost invariably causes Hiryu to hit one of those low barriers or else go sailing into the air twice as high as normal. There is no in-between. It's a real mess of a game, one so janky that Capcom didn't even bother to release it outside the US. Which is a shame because its rambling mess of a story only makes sense if you read the manga adaptation, which Capcom only published in Japan. Add to that the weird loading pauses, the abysmally brain-dead boss battles, and the clunky translation, and you end up with a game that, despite some interesting ideas, feels like a step backward for the Metroidvania genre. BIONIC Commando did this story-driven action format a year earlier with far greater success. No, Strider feels like the first game we've seen in the Metroidvania's evolutionary timeline that feels like a step backward. Rather than advancing the state-of-the-art, it plays more like a throwback to Wing a MADOOLA. Rough, glitchy, unbalanced, and obtuse. This kind of clunky design and barely holding together tech may have flown in 1986 because no one knew how these things were supposed to work. But turn the clock ahead to mid-1989, and Strider becomes a lot harder to justify. I guess this isn't the worst thing in the world. It's good to see that even as things progressed forward, the Metroidvania genre still suffered its setbacks and challenges, sometimes from studios that should have been able to produce far more impressive output. And hey, despite its flaws, Strider for NES wasn't a total loss. Double Helix used it as their starting point for their greatly improved 2014 release by the same name. Thankfully, Willow feels much more convincing than Strider. This game has nothing whatsoever to do with the Capcom coin-op by the same title aside from the fact that it ties into the same movie, but that actually works in its favor. Willow in arcades played as a sort of half-step between early Capcom action platformers like Ghosts and Goblins and CPS-era RPG-inflected adventures like Magic Sword and Dungeons & Dragons. More of a platform shooter than a melee brawler, Willow allowed players to take control of Mad Mardigan, a sword-slinging warrior, and Willow Ufgood, a diminutive mage. The NES game puts you entirely in control of just Willow, shifts the action from side-scrolling to top-down, and lands at a pretty solid approximation of The Legend of Zelda. The original, not Zelda 2, even though everyone else was copying that one right around this period. Willow clearly cops from Zelda in terms of its viewpoint, its screen-by-screen progression, and its division into overworld and underworld. The hero wields a sword and shield with one button and can use his offhand button to use implements or cast spells that enhance his survival odds. Yet Willow the game has no interest in being a limp, uninspired imitation of Nintendo's hit. It simply uses the original Zelda as the launching point for a more cohesive interpretation of the term action RPG, and along the way it manages to advance the genre and even hints at things to come in Nintendo's next Zelda. Consider the way Willow wields his sword. Rather than simply stabbing as Link did in the first Zelda, he attacks one of two ways. Pressing in a given direction as you attack results in a stabbing thrust, but attacking from a neutral stance causes Willow to swing in a wide arc, almost identical to Link's sword strikes in A Link to the Past. Likewise, Willow uses tools to cast magic, including acorns that stun enemies and a staff that casts a healing spell. But rather than using these implements infinitely or expending coins to activate them, Willow has a mana meter. In any case, Willow couldn't use money to power his spells because this game lacks an economy. Willow doesn't need to buy things because the citizens of the realm will simply give him the items he needs for his quest, or else they'll force him to undergo a fetch quest. Or in some cases, he'll simply find the things he needs in chests throughout dungeons and overland. This has its benefits, as you never need to stand around grinding for money, which is nice. And you can often acquire a weapon that offers massively more power than you might need at a given moment. This is not to say that grinding doesn't exist in Willow, because the game simply replaces its cash economy with an experience system. Willow's strength can grow through 16 levels, and you earn experience by defeating monsters. The higher your level, the greater Willow's max hit points and magic points, obviously. However, the experience system does come with an interesting aspect that affects the moment-to-moment design in a clever way. Each weapon Willow acquires has its own de facto level requirement. The more powerful the blade, the higher Willow's experience level needs to be in order to wield it effectively. But that's not to say you can't wield it at all. Rather, until Willow meets the skill requirement for a given sword, he can only use it clumsily. In practice, this amounts to slower attacks that leave the hero more vulnerable to enemies. Once Willow has built up enough experience to master a sword, he can swing and thrust quickly, almost in a Strider-like blur. But with a sword whose mastery exceeds Willow's current experience, you could only thrust and stab at a fraction of that speed, with more downtime between attacks. This introduces some great tactical considerations into the mix. Do you venture into battle with the weaker sword you've already mastered? Or do you stick to a harder hitting blade that you've yet to master, even though you swing it like a weak, clumsy kitten? It's a pretty sharp distillation of the EXP concept into a practical, real-time framework. A clever take on the concept of action RPG that would be carried over, albeit less elegantly, into SNK's CRYSTALIS, which would also apply an EXP gain level system and spells into a Zelda-style format. And Willow's interpretation of the RPG aspect of the action RPG draws decidedly on the Japanese console interpretation of the genre. Unlike the original Zelda, Willow doesn't dump you into a vast open world and let you sort your way through it. Rather, it guides you with boundaries and gating and barriers. You can't venture west beyond the starting area until you defeat the first dungeon, since the bridge leading from Nelwyn to Dew has been ensorcelled by the boss who lurks there. You need to bring tokens and items and complete other tasks in order to open up pathways, and to gain access to later dungeons as well, making for a fairly linear journey where the kind souls who refill your health and magic energy become your base camps for each region. Still, Willow does incorporate some degree of backtracking, encouraging you to return to previous areas once you acquire certain items. But for the most part, it sends you on your way, always seeking out new areas and new interactions, a progressive march toward Nockmaar Castle rather than a sally to find new challenges within an open area. Overall, it's one of the better action RPGs of the era, integrating a lot of trends and concepts into a cohesive whole that makes no effort to copy the beats of the film, but simply attempts to capture its spirit. And in the process, it introduces a few elements that would show up in later, more famous action RPGs. Not bad coming from a company that rarely dipped its toe into the genre. Next time on Metroidvania Works, Adol Christin follows in Link's footsteps once again.